Will you strive for justice and peace among all people, and will you guard the dignity of every human being? That is the eighth and final question that forms our baptismal covenant as Episcopalians. Every time we baptize someone, we ask them a series of questions, and that is the eighth question. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people, and will you guard the dignity of every human being? And all of us who are already baptized, we 4 times a year in the Episcopal Church, we renew our baptismal vows, and we are asked again that question. And the stated response, at least in the prayer book, is to respond, I will with God's help. This gospel reading that we just heard moments ago from John's Gospel, which is a lengthy reading, but it tells the story of Jesus' encounter with a Samaritan woman at a well. And at its heart, this is a story about human dignity. It's been the practice for many years, for centuries, for this passage to be interpreted through the lens of sin and redemption. Most people, when they approach this passage, they hear this woman tell Jesus that, or actually Jesus tells the woman that you've had 5 husbands, and now the man that you are currently with is not your husband. And it has been the practice of the church to largely interpret that as some fault or sin that this woman's committed, that she's been married and divorced 5 times, and now she's living with a man that she's not married to. But I'd like to point out to you that at no point in this passage does Jesus really say anything about sin. And Jesus is not shy in talking about sin, but at no point does he suggest to this woman that she's done anything wrong at all. So let's talk about the context of this passage. Jesus is traveling. He's traveling through an area that is a part of Samaria. The Samaritans were sort of the ancient arch nemesis of the Jewish people, of the people of Judea. The Samaritans were viewed by the Judeans as being mixed blood, impure. Even though they were all descended equally from Abraham, the folks who were called the Samaritans had married off into non-Abrahamic peoples. And so they were seen, their bloodline was seen as tainted, as mixed blood. They were ritually impure. The way that they approached their faith in God was considered incorrect and almost an anathema to the Jewish people. And so good, observant, faithful Jewish people were never to interact with Samaritans. And so here Jesus is traveling through Samaria, and he is tired. It's at the middle of the day when the sun is the highest and the heat is the most intense. And so he stops off at a public well. This is sort of the equivalent of stopping off at a rest stop on the turnpike in the first century world. And he stops there to sort of get a drink of water and to collect himself. And lo and behold, this woman, the Samaritan woman, comes to the well, which is a little unusual, because most women who would have gone out to get water for their family's needs for the day would have gone out at the beginning of the day when the sun was first coming up. That was the practice. The women in the community, most communities, would travel as the sun was coming up out to the communal well, and they would do it in the morning when it was not as hot and it was a little bit easier to travel rather than waiting for later in the day. So the fact that this woman is coming from her village alone at the middle of the day already tells you about her social position within her community. And not only that, as Jesus points out, she's been married 5 times and is now living with a man that she is not married to. And as I said, the tradition has been that this woman must be an adulteress. That must be why she's being shunned by her village and why she's traveling alone at midday to the well. But I would suggest that there's nothing in the text that tells us that that's the case about this woman. Most likely, she's been widowed 5 times. And it was the custom in the first century world in both the Jewish and Samaritan communities that if a woman was widowed at a time in life when she was beyond childbearing years, and if she was without a male child, then it was the expectation that the brother of her deceased husband would take her as at least his legal wife so that he could provide for her, but they would not be married in the fullest sense of the word. It was called a levirate marriage. So when she says that I've been married 5 times and the man I'm currently living with, I'm not really married to him, most likely she's been widowed 5 times and is now under the custody of her deceased husband's brother. And remember that this is a time and place where tragedy was often interpreted as judgment from God for some sin that was committed. So here, if she's been widowed 5 times, it would make sense then that her community would begin to isolate and ostracize her. Partly because it's our natural tendency, if we're really honest, to avoid people who are subject to a lot of calamity, but lest their bad luck rub off on us. But also, they would have seen the loss of her husbands as the mark of God's punishment. So here she is traveling to the well at midday by herself in the heat, in the height of the day's heat. And she encounters this Jewish man, Jesus, who strikes up a conversation with her. Everything about this conversation would have been taboo. He's a Jew, she's a Samaritan. He's a Jew, she's a Samaritan. That was the biggest issue. But also, he's a man, and she is an unaccompanied woman who is not related to him. So for her to have a conversation with him, also that would have been taboo, because a woman traveling by herself, unaccompanied by a male family member, would not have engaged another man outside the family in conversation. And clearly, she's also an ostracized woman who is not even accepted in her own community. But Jesus engages her. And he not only engages her in conversation, but he actually talks theology with her. He talks about God with her, which is really something that he only should have been doing with other Jewish males. Everything about this conversation is a taboo. But he does it. And the interesting thing is, she is not only surprised by this conversation, but she engages back with him. And in the course of that conversation, he makes a promise to her that ultimately she will be gifted by God with this living water that will, as Jesus says, gush up to eternal life. He essentially says to her that God has not abandoned you or forsaken you, that in fact, God is going to bless you. In short, Jesus affirmed her dignity as a child of God. Jesus affirmed her dignity. This Samaritan woman who was ostracized in her own community, Jesus affirms her dignity. And her response is extraordinary. Because the gospel tells us that after Jesus has this conversation with her, she immediately turns and runs back to her community, to the very community that has ostracized her and probably considers her cursed of God. And she returns to that community and essentially becomes the first evangelist of the gospel to be found in the Gospel of John. She goes back and tells them what she's encountered in this man that she has met at the well. This ostracized Samaritan woman who has to go to the well alone at the heat of the day becomes the first evangelist in John's gospel. That's the power of human dignity. So I ask you, will you strive for justice and peace among all people? And will you guard the dignity of every human being? I will with God's help.